So hello everyone, welcome to this week's edition of the ITS Davis Friday seminar. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to do a little bit of business for our students. First, I want to remind you that you need to be submitting 3 questions for the speaker via Canvas before next week's seminar for you to get your credit. So don't forget to be submitting your questions. And then as for questions during the talk today, this is a new system, but this is how it's going to work. The students are all in the seminar as panelists. So during the talk, you can chat questions, but then we will, at the end, have open question and answers where you can unmute if you would like and ask your question yourself. And then for those of you who are not students enrolled in the seminar, you can be submitting questions versus Q&A. And then either Kelcie will be reading those or I'll be pulling some of those out to read to her. But we are going to let students ask questions first before we open it up to everybody else. So if you have questions about that, chat me. And I'll be responding there. And now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker and we'll get going. Unfortunately, we're not going to have her video, but we've got her slides and her audio. And I am delighted to introduce Kelcie Ralph, who is an assistant professor at the Bloustein School of Urban Planning at Rutgers University. She has a PhD in urban planning from UCLA. Where she did important and widely cited work about trends in the travel behavior of younger people, and really took on this pervasive belief that maybe young people are driving less and the future will be wonderful, and turns out maybe that's not so. And her work since then has continued to really take on some of these common beliefs and assumptions that we're making in the transportation field. So today's talk falls right into that category, and we're going to look at the issue of distracted walking. So please join me in welcoming Kelcie. Thank you.
Thank
Kelcie.
you so much, Susan. All right, so my goal today is twofold. For those of you who believe that distracted walking is a serious problem, my aim is to convince you otherwise. And for everyone else who believes that distracted walking maybe isn't such a big problem, my goal is to give you the data to feel confident when you're engaging with someone who does believe it's a problem. So to be very clear from the get-go, I know that people walk distracted, but I do hope today to convince you of 4 things. First, that there is very little evidence that distracted walking is all that harmful. Nevertheless, many practitioners still worry about distracted walking. I hope to convince you that worrying about distracted walking is harmful. And finally, I'm going to give you some advice to avoid the temptation to worry. I'm going to cover quite a lot in this talk, but I want you to know that everything is available in this open access article, Distracted by Distracted Pedestrians. So if you found something you like, you can download it and share it. So let's go bit by bit. There's very little evidence that distracted walking is especially harmful. And to answer, or to sort of lay the groundwork for this, I wanted to critically review the 5 most cited papers in this field. And these papers are cited in order of magnitude more than anything else. And they were also conducted fairly early in the concern about distracted walking, so they got a lot of media attention when they were first published. But just to make sure that I hadn't missed any newer studies, I also consulted a meta-analysis with 17 papers included in it. So that's going to be able to flesh out my understanding beyond those 5 really carefully reviewed papers. So when we're talking about distracted walking from a scholarly perspective, we tend to try to answer 4 questions. First, how many people are walking distracted? When they are walking distracted, what distracts them? What are they doing? does that distraction change their behavior in any meaningful way, change the way that they cross the street? And then the most important, is all of this distraction unsafe? In answering these questions, scholars draw on 3 different methods. They either observe pedestrians in their natural environment, they conduct experiments in controlled settings, or they analyze existing crash data. Now, each of these approaches has strengths and weaknesses, and each method answers some questions better than others. So we're going to go through each of those approaches in turn. So observational studies. These are best suited for telling us how often distraction occurs. But there's a caveat, and that is that observations may not be representative. So for example, many initial studies of distracted walking focused on college campuses. But the great waves of students moving between classes is probably not a good indication of how the general public acts, okay? It's difficult to use observational studies to identify the type of distraction. Selecting a song from a playlist looks pretty similar to texting. Having a conversation on your headphones looks very similar to listening to music. It's just hard to tell just by watching someone. Observational studies can, though, they can offer suggestive evidence on how distraction affects pedestrian behavior. Although, of course, we need to be careful that any differences we observe may not be due strictly to the distraction, but could be due to other factors. Finally, observational studies are not great for evaluating safety because it's really difficult for an observer sort of standing on the side of the road to make a split-second judgment about how safe or unsafe a behavior was unless it was egregiously unsafe. That's the story on observation. Let's talk about experiments. In experimental studies, participants cross the street a number of times, either in a laboratory with a virtual reality roadway or in a controlled setting with a paid experimenter sort of making sure that they're safe, don't step out in front of a car. And in these experiments, participants cross several times without a distraction, and then again with a distraction. So we know that any differences are due just to their distraction. So obviously this design cannot tell us how often distraction occurs, but it can provide suggestive evidence about the effects of distraction. But I want to be really clear that again, these experimental results, they might not generalize to the real world. So a couple of reasons why. First, the stakes are incredibly low. If you're in a virtual reality environment, getting hit by a car, not a big deal. Obviously, much bigger deal in real life. The other issue is that the travel speeds are usually fixed, both for the person who's crossing the street and for the driver. Neither one of them are able to adjust their speed in any way and to avoid a collision. So in this way, it's pretty different than the real world. And finally, we have to remember that in these experiments, participants are specifically told to walk distracted, answer the phone call no matter what, do the text messaging no matter what, and they might act differently outside of that sort of experimental setting. Okay, so we've talked about observations and experiments. Let's talk briefly about crash data. That's our third option. And the problem here is that crash data tends to be pretty poor. The chief problem is that we do not measure distraction consistently. And that includes, by the way, the Fatality Analysis Reporting System, or the FARS database, sort of our go-to data for information on crashes. They do not measure crashes consistently. Also, FARS uses a pretty strange definition of pedestrian. It includes anyone outside of a vehicle. So if you're sitting in your yard sunbathing or fixing a flat tire, you're considered a pedestrian in that data set. And then finally, above and beyond those issues, we know for a fact that crash analysis reports are often incomplete and inaccurate. So basically, we just don't know. We don't have great data. So let's talk through each of these questions in turn with the best data that we have available. So do people walk distracted? The answer is emphatically yes. Many of them do. Based on observations of thousands of people at multiple intersections by many different scholars, we know that somewhere between 12% of the population and 45% of the population are walking distracted. And by the way, it tends to be worse on college campuses. So we know that they're distracted. What is it that's distracting them? So here I've listed the results from one study in Seattle. This is again of thousands of pedestrians, but the pattern of results is similar no matter where we look. Most often people are walking using headphones. They're less likely to be looking at their screen actively, and they're even less likely to be talking on their phone by like holding their phone up to the ear the old-fashioned way. So now we know how many people walk distracted and what distracts them. Let's talk about whether distraction changes behavior. So we're going to ask a couple of specific questions within this realm. Are people more likely to stay within the crosswalk and cross with the light? Are they less likely to look both ways? Are they less likely to recognize gaps in traffic? Do they cross more slowly? And fortunately, I can say that based on the literature review and the meta-analysis, that there is no big effect, in fact, no effect for listening to music via headphones, which was the most common form of distraction. So we're going to focus the rest of this review on what happens when folks are looking directly at their phone or when they're speaking on the phone by holding it up to their ear. Okay, so first question, are people more likely to stay or to leave the crosswalk and cross with the light? And in fact, they're more likely to stay within the crosswalk and cross with the light if they are texting or talking on their phone. So this is positive news. They're actually more compliant if they're texting. How about looking both ways? This is a big maybe. Observational studies suggest that they do look less often. And there's a number of caveats there that I do want to talk about in just a second. But the experimental results are mixed. So studies with completely identical designs show conflicting results. Sometimes people look left and right less often. Sometimes they look exactly the same amount. Overall, the meta-analysis of those 17 studies suggests that there's maybe a very small reduction in looking both ways. And if so, it's only for people who are texting. So I mentioned that there were some caveats, though, for those observational studies, and let me tell you what I mean. The authors use incredibly stringent definitions of looking both ways. So immediately before stepping out into the street, pedestrians had to look to the left and to the right, and then step out by physically turning their head side to side. Very few people do this, even when they're not distracted. In one of the studies, it was just 35% of people turning their heads, and in another, it was 54%. So probably not a great indication of safety because so few people are doing this regardless. The other caveat I want to mention about those observational studies is that these were conducted at really busy intersections. And the authors acknowledged that many of the distracted pedestrians were crossing in groups. And so you can imagine that they're sort of offloading some of that responsibility to the other pedestrians around them. So they themselves don't need to look both ways because they can trust the guy in front of them that they have done so. All right. How about recognizing gaps in traffic? So these are all from experimental results, and I will say that they are incredibly mixed in terms of the results. Some said yes, there was an effect, and some said no. The meta-analysis found a very small effect, but this time just for talking on a cell phone. And I want to make really clear that it's not necessarily a big deal that people have a hard time recognizing gaps in traffic, because people here might be compensating for their distraction. They're looking for extremely wide gaps to make sure that they're going to be able to cross safely while texting or talking. And I want to be clear that this approach is working fairly well. So there's a study by one group who found that people who were distracted were less able to recognize the gaps in traffic, okay? Less able to recognize gaps. But the authors also noticed that there was no difference for this distracted groups in how often they were hit or nearly hit in the simulator. So in some, people are compensating and it seems to be working pretty well. How about crossing more slowly? We care about crossing speeds because it determines how long you're in the intersection and exposed to risk. Data for this question comes from observations and experiments. And in the 5 studies that I reviewed, it did seem to suggest that pedestrians crossed more slowly. But I want to be clear that the meta-analysis found no effect. And even more importantly, that when individual studies did find an effect, we're not talking about crawling across the intersection here. We're talking about relatively moderate speeds. And we know this because some of the scholars also estimated the age of pedestrians and compared the effect of distraction to the effect of being a little bit older. So the delay associated with talking on the phone was roughly the same as the delay of being middle-aged, 45 to 64. And the delay associated with texting was akin to being over 65. So distraction slows people down for sure, but it is well within normal walking speeds that our intersection should be able to accommodate. So to summarize the results for whether distraction affects walking, listening to music does not affect walking. Distraction does slow people down, but it's well within the range of normal behavior. Distraction may lead to people to look both ways less often and may lead people to wait for larger gaps in traffic, although the latter seems to be a good compensation mechanism. So basically shrug emoji, net neutral. And best of all, distraction actually improves some behavior, namely crossing with the light. Okay, so now we need to talk about whether distraction is unsafe, which is the main reason that we're here in this talk. And this is the only question that we've addressed so far that uses all 3 methods at the same time. So let's go through them in turn. The first is an observational study, and there is just one that I could find. It is the most widely cited paper on distracted walking with over 300 citations. So the headline finding here is that 48% of people on their phones crossed unsafely. And here the authors, when they say unsafely, they mean that someone was at risk of getting hit by a car. 48% seems troubling to me. You can imagine that this is why it got cited 300 times. But, and there's always a but, there is an incredibly small sample here. They observed over 100 people walking, but only 25 of those people were actually on a phone at all. Only 11 of those people had a car approaching when they were in the intersection, and only 9 of them stepped off the curb. So first of all, the sample size is incredibly small. 48% of people were crossing unsafely out of 25, so 12 of them, okay. And also the numbers don't really seem to add up. If 9 people stepped out with a car approaching, how was it that 12 of them were unsafe? The authors must have counted some of them as unsafe if they were like crossing when there was no car approaching or when a car was already stopped. I'm truly puzzled by this paper. But let's move on from the observational studies and talk about the experiments. Here in experiments, we're talking about whether people got hit or nearly hit in that virtual reality environment. And some experiments find that there are more hits and some do not. The key difference between those experiments is whether the participant could adjust their speed, their walking speed, as they crossed. So in experiments where people could walk a little bit faster to avoid being hit, there was no difference, in their tendency to get hit or to experience close calls. So with that caveat in mind, I want to say that the meta-analysis of all 17 studies found moderate increases in virtual hits among people texting and a very, very small increase in virtual hits among people talking on the phone. But again, that study or that meta-analysis includes all of those studies where people could not speed up at all. Also remember, with any experimental studies, we need to keep in mind those caveats that participants were told to cross distracted and stay distracted the entire time, and that there is no real risk. So these behaviors might not generalize. So enough about observations and experiments. Let's talk about crash data. Remember, of course, those caveats I mentioned about crash data before, peculiar definitions of pedestrians, often incomplete and inaccurate, and most importantly, do not measure distraction consistently. So with that being said, we're going to try to estimate the share of pedestrian injuries and deaths associated with distraction. And overall, I'm going to say that my best estimate is that distracted walking probably accounts for somewhere around 5% of pedestrian deaths and injuries. Maybe up to 10, but certainly far less than 20%. And I want to show you how I got to that estimation. The first comes from New York City, and this is my high estimate. In New York City, pedestrian error or confusion was a factor in 21% of the fatal or serious injury crashes involving a pedestrian. So pedestrian error, 21%, but this is probably a pretty significant overestimate of the effect of distraction because it includes all kinds of other behaviors, right? Crossing against a signal where distraction might be a factor, and things like crossing mid-block where it is unlikely to be a factor. You don't often see people jaywalking and texting at the same time. So that's my upper estimate. How about a sort of more reasonable estimate? This one comes from a nationwide study of emergency room records on the cause of the injury, so what landed someone in the emergency room. And of all of the people who were injured while they were walking, 3.7% of them were using a phone when they were injured. And the authors offer a couple of examples. So one patient ran into a sign and had a laceration on his forehead. One unfortunate teenager fell into a little ditch, hurt his arm. But one in this example was hit by a driver while walking on the sidewalk, talking on the phone. So it's hard to attribute that to distraction per se. So as I've mentioned, there's not great data, and that's pretty frustrating. We can't just look it up. But what we can do is use other data to help triangulate and make sure that we understand the impact of distraction. So I'm going to say that there are many other plausible explanations for the number of pedestrian deaths and the recent rise in pedestrian deaths. So first, we would expect more crashes just because there are more people each year and more driving each year. Between 2008 and 2017, the population increased to 6.9% and driving increased 8%. I want to be clear though that that is not the whole story. Pedestrian deaths per million miles driven went up 30%, and pedestrian deaths per million people also increased 28%. So walking is definitely getting riskier. And why could that be? Well, we need to look at the rise of SUVs, which increased 37% between 2009 and 2016. Now, why is that important? Well, when you get hit by an SUV, the SUV hits your internal organs and tends to pull you under the vehicle. By contrast, when you get hit by a normal sedan, it tends to hit your legs and it tends to throw you over the hood. Needless to say, you are far more likely to survive being hit by a sedan than by an SUV, even if you're hit at the same speed. But to make matters worse, SUVs have become increasingly more powerful and larger over time. And drivers with high-powered vehicles tend to travel at higher speeds, which in turn increases crash severity. So we have more SUVs, they're bigger and faster, and are likely hitting more people. We also have to remember that distracted driving remains incredibly prominent. Despite lots of laws against it, many drivers on the street are distracted themselves. And finally, Americans are moving to riskier places to be pedestrians. So I analyzed where folks were moving, and the 10 fastest growing states had 40% more pedestrian fatalities per person and 79% more, or 79% higher pedestrian danger index than the remaining 40 states. So we're moving from safer places to riskier places. All right, we can do another bit of sort of data triangulation, and that is to state that if this were about distraction, what would we expect to see? Well, we might expect more pedestrian deaths in areas stereotypically associated with phone-addicted young people. This is simply not the case. San Francisco, New York, Seattle, they all have lower pedestrian risks than the national average. So do college towns like Cambridge, Mass, and Madison, Wisconsin. By contrast, the pedestrian deaths are highest, like 5 to 10 times higher in Florida, where they're better known for their inhospitable streetscapes than their tech-obsessed pedestrian. We can do another data triangulation, and this is about age. If this were about distraction, we would expect death rates to increase the most for age groups who are on their phones all of the time, but we don't see that. Pedestrian deaths per million people increased the most over the past few years among people over 30, and especially among people over 60. By contrast, pedestrian deaths grew very slowly for those ages 20 to 29 and did not increase at all for teenagers. And they even went down for people under 13. These are the folks who are on their phones. Finally, I want to play one more piece of evidence, and that is that in 2006, this is a year before the smartphone was ever invented or unveiled, 60,000 pedestrians were injured. 4,784 people were killed in car crashes walking in our country. So these folks were not distracted by cell phones. The roadway conditions that killed them and led to their deaths, they persist today. So we shouldn't be focused just on that change in the death rate, but know that we've had a very serious problem for a very long time. So I hope I've convinced you of this first part, that there is little evidence that distracted walking is especially harmful. I lingered on this for a long time because it is so important to the rest of the work. If you buy into this, you'll buy into the rest. So let's shift gears and talk about how many practitioners worry about this. So what I did to figure this out is I surveyed transportation practitioners about their level of concern and their preferred solutions. I talked to 278 people at Walk Bike Places, the 2018 Transportation Camp in New York City, and the Transportation Research Board Conference. And I asked them two key questions. In your view, how big of a problem is distracted walking, large, small, or not? And then because this question has some serious problems, I also asked them to estimate the share of deaths due to distracted walking. And unsurprisingly, these were incredibly highly correlated in the survey. Folks who said it was a large problem tended to make higher estimates. So within this group of transportation practitioners, fully 1 in 3 of them believed that distracted walking is a large problem. And they estimated on average that it was responsible for 40% of pedestrian deaths. And within this group, some practitioners made even higher estimates. So 1 in 6 transportation professionals in the United States believe that over half of pedestrian deaths are due to distracted walking. And 1 in 10 of them, 1 in 10, believe that more than 75% of pedestrian deaths were due to distraction. My point here is that for some practitioners, the idea of distracted walking has really, really taken hold. So I want to just point out here that people are far more worried about distracted walking if they spend a lot of time in their car and they spend very little time in pedestrian areas. You can see that folks in their car are less likely to say it's not a problem and more likely to say it is a big problem. We can also see that even when we account for travel mode, age, and sex, that folks who are engineers or trained in public health are also far more likely to think of distracted walking as a big problem, and they tend to make much higher estimates than our planners. Okay, so folks are worried about distracted walking. Let's explore why that is such a problem. And the big point here is that how we frame problems shapes how we go about solving them. And so I want to suggest that the distracted walking frame tends to increase support for education and reduces support for lowering speeds. That is, we're shifting from things that we know work to things that are sort of easier to accomplish but are less effective. Let me show you the data to back that up. So here we have a comparison of the preferred approaches to dealing with pedestrian death. And we're comparing folks who said it was a large problem to folks who said it was not a problem at all. And you can see along the top that folks who said it was a large problem are far more likely to prefer education for either pedestrians or drivers, and far less likely to want to lower speed limits or reduce speeds via changes to the streetscape. I want to emphasize once more that these solutions are less effective. In another way, we're sort of focusing on these individual level solutions like education and moving away from systems-based solutions like street improvement. Another problem with the distracted walking frame is that it detracts from bigger and more serious issues in transportation safety. So remember, the data is pretty sparse, but I believe that distracted walking is probably 5, maybe 10% of all pedestrian deaths, and certainly less than 20. But that pales in comparison to speeding, which is responsible for 26% of total fatal crashes nationwide. Alcohol and drugs, responsible for 47% of fatal crashes nationwide. And driver inattention, which is responsible for 57% of injurious crashes in New York City. The asterisk is because it's a different data source. I just wanted to point that out. So the distracted walking frame narrows the call to action. It means that the changes that we need to make are rather superficial, not foundational. The underlying system can remain completely intact. And it absolves practitioners like you guys from the need to rethink their values, rethink their priorities, and rethink their funding structures. It's also inconsistent with Vision Zero, which is premised on the idea that streets should be safe for all users. So remember I said that distracted walking studies do find that people walk a little bit more slowly and may lead them to identify fewer, safer gaps in traffic. They might look left and right less often when crossing the street. Well, it sounds pretty similar to me to elderly people who take longer to cross, or children who are known to struggle to identify crossing opportunities. And also looking left and right for blind people won't help all that much. So if our approach to improving safety is to chastise distracted pedestrians, we should be really comfortable with the corollary, and that is that streets will remain unsafe for the elderly, for children, and for vision impaired people. Finally, I want to mention that distracted walking frame increases policing, which we know can have damaging effects damaging and disproportionate effects on communities of concern. It's not something I focus on in my work, but it's certainly a problem. So hopefully by now, I have convinced you that worrying about distracted walking is harmful. So now we need to understand what we can do to avoid the temptation to worry. And to do that, we need to understand why it is that this is so gosh darn trendy. So I first want to mention some cognitive biases. The first is the availability bias, which is when it's easier to remember memorable examples of something. And all of these ads about distracted walking offer pretty memorable instances and humorous instances of it. There's also confirmation bias. If we think it's a problem, we're going to see more of it when we look around. And probably most importantly is this idea of the illusory truth effect, which is that ideas seem true if we hear them again and again and again. This is particularly important because distracted walking is very newsworthy. This is just a sampling of the headlines about distracted walking from the national press. Many, many more have occurred since this. Many, many more have occurred in local journalism. Basically, we've been hit over the head again and again that distracted walking is a problem. I also want to make a quick note about publication bias and hype. So publication bias is this idea that if you find sort of newsworthy or big results, you're more likely to get published. And that's been true for a long time. And in turn, folks who get things published are more likely to get their results covered in the press. But I want to talk about this sort of disturbing trend of scholars hyping their ideas within their own articles, even when their evidence does not support their conclusion. So for example, I have this quote on the left, the literature review called distracted walking an imminent threat to safety, while later in the article noting that they were unable to find sufficient and accurate data for evaluating distracted walking problems. So not enough data, but nevertheless, they feel comfortable calling it an imminent threat to safety. Or we talk about the article on the right, which was cited 195 times. Here, the authors concluded, and I quote, distracted walking does impact a pedestrian's ability to successfully navigate a street crossing, despite finding absolutely no difference in the success crossing the street, the number of collisions that the person experienced, the number of times people looked right or left, or the distance to the nearest car. So it's like that near miss. So they found no differences in each of these, but did feel comfortable concluding that distracted walking does impact their ability to successfully navigate a street crossing. I want to talk about one more example of hype. So remember earlier I mentioned emergency room records, where the authors found that about 4% of pedestrian injuries were associated with a cell phone. So the authors go on to argue that distraction is grossly underreported, which it is, and they extrapolated a bit, I should say a lot. They multiplied their observed injuries by a factor of 1,300, which led them to conclude that there might have been about 2 million pedestrian injuries related to mobile phone use in 2010. This is a gross overstatement. Only 66,000 people were injured walking each year. So their estimate of the number of pedestrians who were just injured while distracted is 30 times greater than the total number of people who were injured walking at all. And again, like a game of telephone, this claim gets repeated in the media. It's first repeated by the Governor's Highway Safety Association, and then repeated verbatim as a fact in the press. I want to be completely clear that I don't think that these authors are bad people. It is totally common to frame our own research problems as something incredibly pressing, but I do think that we need to be careful not to overdo it and to make our findings clear for the public. Let's see. I also think, though, that distracted walking is incredibly popular because it is convenient and strategic for us to adopt it. So I want to talk about two different examples of this. The first is within the automotive industry itself. They have an incentive to promote the idea of distracted walking because focusing on those pesky behavior or those pesky pedestrians absolves them of any responsibility. It's very similar to the invention of jaywalking in the 1920s. And it allows them to keep selling SUVs with onboard entertainment systems, and it helps them avoid this call to action to limit vehicle size or to add crash safety equipment for folks outside of the car. But it's not just the automotive industry, it's also transportation practitioners who may be adopting this because it's convenient and strategic. So it could be that focusing on distracted walking is the path of least resistance. Reducing speeds, increasing enforcement, changing street design, these are all incredibly difficult to achieve. They're time consuming, they're costly, and people tend to hate them. By contrast, educational materials, they're inexpensive. They're pretty straightforward to do, and no one really writes a letter to their mayor being angry about an education campaign. So in that way, it might be easier for us to just embrace this frame. My parting advice, though, is to sort of buck that trend. Avoid false equivalences between distracted driving and distracted walking. Pedestrians may occasionally run into a sign or step into traffic, but remember that their actions endanger themselves. By contrast, drivers, they're imperiling those around them. Cars are big, they're powerful, and drivers are protected by decades and decades of crashworthiness improvements to their cars. They should bear a greater responsibility for road safety. And this should, by the way, be reflected in our enforcement efforts. As you think about pedestrian safety, I encourage you to think about systems, not about individuals. It is very natural to think about individual storylines, but as experts, we need to zoom out. And then I want to make a point for the researchers, and that is that I want to encourage us to not focus exclusively on pedestrian-involved crashes. So to illustrate this point, I want to draw on an example from Edmonton, Canada. In 2017 in Edmonton, drivers hit 284 pedestrians, and they killed 9 of them. The temptation is to dissect the actions of people who were hit. But if we zoom out a little bit, we see that drivers in Edmonton also hit 49,000 other objects that year, including 5,500 of which were stationary, so parked cars and signs. 80% of the people who were hit were killed while walking legally when they were run over by a driver. So this zooming out helps us see that this is a trend of reckless driving at high speeds, not a trend of naughty pedestrians. And I want to make a metaphor in that analyzing just the pedestrian crashes is like selling faulty toasters. And then, when someone's house burns down, we go around and we collect data on whether the victim was making white or wheat or sourdough. It's about the toaster, not the kind of toast. Finally, I encourage you to avoid victim blaming. In the work on distracted pedestrian, we've seen a smattering of really kind of funny and comical campaigns against distracted walking. There are seeing eye people leading people around with a leash. There are people texting and walking sort of wrapped in bubble wrap and wearing a helmet. There are e-lanes for just texters. And while these ideas seem harmless, my contention is that they normalize the idea that pedestrians are to blame for their own deaths. And so it's best to avoid using them. So I hope I've convinced you of these 4 things, that there is very little evidence that distracted walking is all that harmful, that many practitioners are worried about it, that worry is harmful, and that I hope I've given you the tools to avoid that temptation to worry moving forward. As a reminder, all of this is available in this article, and I'll take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Kelcie. That was fabulous. I am so impressed with your meticulous deconstruction of that belief and then your meticulous construction of your argument. This is a great model for our students. Plus lots of great kind of insights into research design and interpreting findings and all of that. So students, I hope you're paying very close attention. So we have had some questions that came in from students, and I think along the way you actually answered a lot of these, but let me give those students a chance to ask the questions. And then, those of you who are not students and are attending as in attendees, you can submit some questions, I think via Q&A. So Lindell, you had a question early on. Did you want to ask that about, Kelcie, you seem to focus mostly on crossing streets, but what about mixed use sorts of facilities?
Oh, sure. Do you mean sort of like walking along the sidewalk and tripping and falling off, or something different?
Well, I think like bike paths, right? So you were mostly focused on
Oh,
pedestrian car
sure.
interactions, and I think most of the research focuses there, but you want to say
Yeah.
a little bit about that?
Primarily because we're interested in injuries and deaths. And I will be the first to say that it is incredibly annoying when you are biking to have someone sort of meandering, weaving to the right and then weaving to the left and, you know, not really deciding where to go. And then, of course, when you ring your bell, they're shocked that you're so close and you've been ringing for 100 yards. So I'm with you. It's really frustrating. But the good news is it tends to only lead to annoyance and not to death. And I want to remain laser focused on improving safety for people who are walking and biking.
Great. And then Ray, you can unmute if you'd like to ask the question.
Thank you, Kelcie.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. My question was, have you considered people with disability or with some difficulties crossing the crosswalk, or that might cause some delay on crossing, and some other, like people with strollers, or some folks with physical disabilities or hearing, or some people with vision impairment?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ray. It's such a good one. And to me, this is why I find this narrative about distracted walking so harmful. Because it says, oh, you're texting? You sort of deserve to be hit by a car. That's your fault. But what it leaves out is the people who are vision impaired, who are hearing impaired, who are crossing with a stroller and taking a little bit longer. And to me, the world that we should live in should be safe for all of those people. And the best way to make it safe for all of those people is to make it safe for a 13-year-old girl who's texting and Skyping and, I don't know, TikToking all at the same time.
Got it.
Thanks. And then Maha, you had a question, I think, about the sort of how you define risk. And, you know, it's interesting to think about how, you know, how these studies measure risk.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Kelcie. That was a really interesting presentation. So I think, I'm not sure exactly what, which slide you mentioned this on, but it was something along the lines of observational studies show that, you know, when people are on their phones, they're not at a larger risk of being hit by a car. So I was just wondering, like, how do we define risk? Would it be kind of breaking the rules, or is it more behavioral? How do you define what risk is in this case?
Can I go back and see if I'm talking about the right slide? Because I want to make sure I answer your question. So
Sure.
Let's see, I'm in the chat and let me switch out of the chat. All right. So here's where I was talking about observational, nope. Gosh, I had more slides than I thought. Okay, is this the one you're talking about or something different?
I distinctly remember seeing the word risk. I'm not sure.
So I'm not entirely sure what you're asking about, but I will try to talk about what authors mean by risk. So in this particular study, it was an observational study, and they said, they defined risk as someone being at risk of being hit by a car. So it was possible, conceivable that it could have happened if someone had not intervened. In the experiment, it's a little bit different and a little bit more precise. So what they're able to calculate is this thing called time to collision. And that's what would happen if the pedestrian had kept walking at the same pace and the cars had kept moving at the same pace. Would they have hit in this virtual reality? And so they're calculating how much of a gap there was between the pedestrian and the car passing through the same point at the same time. I don't know what sort of gaps they had. Was it a second? Was it 3 seconds? Was it 5? I can't recall, but they have a sort of benchmark for what does and does not count as risky.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging thing to measure and a lot of subjectivity, I think, in how you do that.
Yeah.
Scrolling down, Larissa, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So my question is how do these studies account for accidents that are potentially caused by distracted driving in addition to distracted walking?
So I think the first thing we need to do is make sure we start collecting better data on distracted driving. And I've spoken now to quite a few cops about how difficult it is to do this. They love being on distracted walking patrol because they sit in their car and they wait until someone walks by, and then they get out of their car and they sort of hustle over to them and talk to them. They hate being on distracted driving patrol because if they see someone distracted driving, they need to get their car into gear, they need to chase the car down and then have a conversation about distracted driving when the person will say, I wasn't texting, I was just looking down. So we don't, it's hard to do, one, and then we don't have great data on it when it occurs. So we typically only get data on distracted driving when folks have gotten into a crash, and then we tend to just ask them, were you on your phone? And if they say no, we don't write it down. So we definitely need some more systematic work there. I will say that there's been a host of natural driving studies in which there are videos embedded in the car and folks are sort of driving about their day. We usually use these studies to test braking and other driving patterns, but now we can use it to see how often people text and talk on their phones. And you would believe that people who had a camera in their car would be on their best behavior. But it turns out that very, very many of them are texting and talking on their phones and looking at sat nav and whatnot. I don't want to make up a percentage, but it was an extraordinarily high percentage.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have trouble tuning my radio and I worry about what I'm going to do.
Right?
Yeah, Sravya, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Hi, Kelcie. I had a question. In these studies, are both signalized and unsignalized intersections included, or it's only the signalized intersections?
Oh, that is a good question. I think that there are both. There had to be enough cars coming so that needed to, yeah, I'm going to say that there were both.
Okay, yeah.
And yeah, interesting, different sort of issues about the interaction with driver behavior, depending on the kind of intersection. Todd has raised the issue about the term accidents. And do you want to say a little bit about why you're saying crashes and not accidents?
Sure. And this is very much in vogue at the moment, is to say that accident absolves anyone of responsibility. And it makes it seem like an oopsie daisy. Nothing could have been done to prevent this. Whereas crash, the thinking goes, is something that we could prevent. I do think language is important. I actually find this one kind of tricky. I slip into saying accident on occasion, and I don't think that the distinction about causality is so strong. What I will suggest, though, is that passive voice and focusing on having our focus on the pedestrian and talking about a car rather than a driver, I think those language choices really are important. So, sit in, don't say accident, but really, really make sure to focus on the driver and not either the pedestrian or the vehicle.
Right, so that the driver hit the pedestrian, not the car hit the pedestrian.
Yeah, or most common, right, a pedestrian was hit.
Was hit, right.
That is, I think 75% of news coverage describing crashes describes it in that way. And it seems harmless, but we know that the focus of the sentence is the one who gets the most blame, both from experiments that I've conducted and from decades of linguistic research.
So Hayden, I think, has a couple of things for you. Hayden, do you want to unmute?
Hi. Yeah, I love your slides. Like monochromatic.
Thank you.
They look wonderful. And I was also wondering if you give yourself more license to look at your phone when you're walking now, or do you, like, are you more or less distracted as a pedestrian?
No, I'm a complete klutz and will stop. People sort of look at me like, what are you doing? I'm the rare bird who pulls over her car to text. So safety is sort of my #1 priority. And I can say that because I read last year for a research project 200 news articles about traffic crashes in which people biking or walking were killed. And that's all it takes to make sure that you really pay attention.
Yeah. So I mentioned to Kelcie yesterday that my brother is a cognitive neuroscientist, and he's done sort of related research. So anytime he sees me walking and texting, he berates me, but he says it's because our brains can't handle it. And it's true, my brain can't handle it. I always have to stop and do my texting. So maybe there's some self-selection going on. The people who are doing it are able to do it, and others of us know better. Let's see, Trisha.
Hi, yeah, I also really loved your presentation and the slides were just beautiful. And my question is, how did you start thinking about this topic? Like before you did research into it, did you have the sense that maybe this was an overblown concern?
Such a good question. And I will say that I am most often motivated to do the research that I do by anger, and often anger by doom scrolling on Twitter. And all I would see over and over again was people victim blaming. And I knew that I needed to do some research on this to clear that up. And like, I didn't expect to find so many flaws in the studies that I critically reviewed. I figured that the evidence would be sort of clearer, but really painstaking hours of going over, does the standard deviation that they've listed here make any sense? No, it doesn't. I didn't bore you with all of that, but I really was angry. And I think that some scholars are hyping up concern, and I think it's a disservice for everyone, actually.
So there's another fun lesson for you students. Do your research on what you get angry about.
Oh yeah, nothing will motivate you more than seething rage.
That's great. Okay, where am I? Sean? And while Sean's unmuting, Natalie's put a link to a podcast in the chat you guys might want to check out. Sean.
Yeah. Well, yeah, first of all, great presentation, Kelcie. And my comment was, I guess I was kind of thinking of, driverless vehicles. And since, that's kind of the talk of the town lately, and especially in like where I'm from in Phoenix, Waymo, I think now they're offering, taxi rides to people. So that's just starting. So now sticking with that, how will that impact our view of distracted pedestrians? Because then, if there are more collisions with driverless vehicles, we can blame the driver, but that's a computer. So I'm just curious, what do you think about that kind of in the future, and how that will impact our view of distracted pedestrians?
Yeah, Sean, it's such a good question, and one that we're really going to have to grapple with as a profession. Let me first say that regardless of whether a driver or a computer is driving the car, there are physical limits of speed and stopping distance, right? That if a car is going at 45 miles per hour, it's going to need a football field to stop, regardless of whether it's a person or a computer. And I think that there will be considerable pressure to remove pedestrians from the roadway so that we can maintain high speeds and high flows. And I actually think that this movement to talk about distracted pedestrian is sort of the first step in that. And I mentioned in the talk very briefly that in the 1920s, we sort of invented the idea of jaywalking. And so to answer your question, I want to talk just a little bit about that history because I think it will make more sense. At the time, pedestrians were able to walk anywhere and everywhere in the streets, right? And the introduction of the automobile meant that many thousands of people were getting injured and killed. And there were calls to restrict driving, really dramatically restrict speed, restrict areas where people could drive. And automobile interests recognized that this was a pretty serious threat to their business model. And so they worked strategically to invent jaywalking. It wasn't a thing before. And it was a word to describe someone who didn't know what they were doing on city streets. And it went from just being an insult to people getting arrested for it within 25 years. Well, really the heart of it is within 10 years. And I think that same thing is happening right now, right? We had the Complete Streets movement, we had the Vision Zero movement, all of these things moving us towards places where streets are for people, not just for cars. And then all of a sudden we have this huge rise in distracted walking as a concern. And I think this is part of a strategic effort to remove pedestrians from the streets so that we can make way for high speed, high flow, autonomous vehicles.
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah. Maha, did you want to ask a question?
I was just wondering, like, what does the evidence, experimental or observational, say about, the driver's side of it? Are SUV drivers found to be more aggressive than sedan drivers? And how does this entertainment thing, affect driver behavior as well?
Yes. So I do know that there's a study on this. It's from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, IIHS. I always get my acronyms confused. And they have an excellent study on this about risk-taking by automobile sides. I cite them in my paper. I just can't remember the author's name at the moment.
Generally, do you feel like there's more focus on the pedestrians and less on the drivers?
Yes.
As academic research is concerned?
Yes. I just got done reviewing the Connecticut Pedestrian Safety Guide, in which they observed 27,000 people crossing streets at intersections. And they go to great lengths to tell us how many of them were crossing distracted, how many of them were failing to yield. At no point in this report do they mention how many drivers failed to yield to pedestrians. And we know from very excellent work by Tara Goddard and others that people do not stop for people crossing. And in fact, the more expensive the car you drive, the less likely you are to stop, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking of that study. It's just classic. So we do have a question from beyond the student realm, and I want to remind anybody listening in that you can type questions in Q&A. So this is Prashant, who's a postdoc here at ITS Davis, wants to know what lessons can we draw from the success of MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and related campaigns in ultimately stigmatizing drunk driving. Could MAD succeed today, given the greater proliferation of distractions that can produce many more convenient scapegoats? Interesting.
That's such a good question. It is definitely trickier to convince the vast majority of people who are texting and driving that they are as menacing as the small minority of people who are drinking and driving. That being said, I want to point to one thing that was unique about MAD, and I think that we would do well to learn that lesson today. Mothers Against Drunk Driving started as a national organization, but was very good at facilitating decentralized leadership. So they had a pamphlet of materials, a structure to set up your meetings, and then they let you run with it. And I think that it would behoove transportation advocates to do the same sort of thing today, to have a national clearinghouse for these sorts of materials, and then embolden and empower locally based advocacy groups to get the message across.
Yeah, and there, I mean, there's certainly a strong advocacy network around walking and biking that could really maybe tackle this supposed distracted walking issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we do have a lot of distracted biking in Davis.
I'm sure.
Yeah, I often wonder about that. The hands-free, students biking hands-free while they're doing something on their phone.
It's the most niche of all of the research streams, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's all I've got so far in chat and Q&A. Anybody want to unmute and ask another question? Or type something in?
I have another question. This is Larissa. The question I have is regarding, you were just talking about earlier about street infrastructure and how roads and pedestrian walkways should be separate. And so it reminded me of kind of as a potential planner, I would like to understand, like, what are some of the challenges that you might face to have those plannings be possible?
So I don't think that I said that drivers and pedestrians should be separate. There are certainly examples of places where vehicle speeds and volumes are so low that it is perfectly safe to intermingle. I think that is definitely possible. But I do foresee quite a few challenges in terms of just making our streetscapes safe for people. So one is political, and that is that many folks, when we try to narrow traffic lanes, make things safer, many folks will go to meetings and say, I oppose these changes. And so what I'm working on now with a team of colleagues from across the United States is to look at how prevalent those views are. Because we see that just a few lone voices are able to hijack community meetings and say, we want to maintain high speeds. And what we're seeing from our very initial results is that nationwide, many people do want improvements in safety, do want changes to their streets. They're just not the folks who show up for these meetings and sort of yell at their council members. So I think we've got a political issue here in terms of how we make decisions and in terms of sort of bravery of political officials to stick to their guns. But another challenge, of course, is that it is expensive to change streetscapes. And it is a question of prioritization and scale. You can imagine if we do sort of very, very nice work, it's only going to be done in a couple of places, and those places are likely to experience gentrification and other pressures. But if we are doing things in sort of a low touch or a low cost, light touch situation, we could really quickly deploy improvements everywhere. There's also a question of whether we go sort of full bore, or if we sort of incrementally do this work. And I think recently there's been some pretty strong arguments that we need to act decisively and swiftly so that we can see the system's benefits from improvements in these things. But you're right that this is the heart of the question. How do we make these streetscape changes? And you can imagine, right, if all it takes is a couple of minutes of thinking through all the challenges to think, oh yeah, let's do an education campaign instead.
Yeah. Jarrell's question is related to this, I think. Jarrell, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, Kelcie. I'm originally from New York, so I always fight for my right on the on the right of way whenever I'm crossing and avoid using my phone. So yeah, it kind of just goes off that question. Do you think with current trends with COVID and outdoor dining that there could be a potential expansion of streets and takeaway parking and put more I guess, yeah, put more room on the street for people to just, eat outside or just go for a walk, considering current trends?
Yeah, I think obviously the pandemic is horrific, but this is a really excellent opportunity to make dramatic changes to our streetscapes. I do worry that we might have missed a lot of that opportunity, at least in the neighborhoods I live in. Driving seems back to where it was before. But to the extent that we can use this this opportunity, I think we should go for it. It's a great one.
And then Rosa has a question about shifting from daylight time to standard time. What do we know about the impact of that? That's coming up.
I have heard, it could be apocryphal, but I have heard that the day after we switch is the worst day for traffic collisions, bar the New Year's Eve and the Super Bowl and maybe one other day. That these days are just heads and shoulders worse than the others because we are tired, and it turns out that humans need a lot of sleep. But beyond that, I don't know. I've heard that it's true. I can't point you to the documentation to prove it, but I'm sure it exists, Rosa.
Yeah, Rosa says I knew it. Yeah. All right, and then we're getting towards the end, but Lindell, do you want to ask one more? If anybody's got a last minute question, get them in. Lindell?
I can see Lindell's question.
Okay.
So it says, should there be a further category beyond over age 65, such as impaired or disabled? Probably not. I mean, we could probably do a higher age range, but again, this wasn't an observational study, so people were guessing at the age of folks anyways. And it's hard to tell the difference when we're just guesstimating ages.
All right, any last questions out there? Oh, wait, another one from Todd. Isn't distracted walking really just walking?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. So I mentioned the Connecticut Public Safety or Pedestrian Safety Guide earlier, and they have an entire section on distraction, and far and away the most distracted or the most common form of distraction that they observed was people talking to another person walking next to them. And they go on to talk about how dangerous it is to walk distracted. And like you, I think that is just walking, and that is not the world in which I want to live. So fight the urge to label anything that used to be normal distracted walking.
Well, I think that's a very nice note to end on. So I'd like to ask all the students to unmute and do a thank you for Kelcie. And then we'll hang around for a little bit if anybody wants to chat some more. So ready? Unmute.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's always nice to know there are people out there. So yeah, thanks everybody for attending. Thanks so much to Kelcie for sharing her time with us in this wonderful study. And we'll just have to get you out to Davis in person one of these days. Students, don't forget to, students, don't forget to submit your questions. And like I said, we can hang out for a few minutes here if anybody wants to chat.